Now, I'm sure you've all heard the expression, as American as apple pie. Well, as American as apple pie is, there may be nothing more English than an afternoon cup of tea. And if you were to transpose this reasoning to the dark terrain of true crime, you could also say that a fatal poisoning is as English a thing as a mass shooting is American. In his humorous essay, The Decline of the English Murder, George Orwell complained about the lack of patience and imagination in modern murders, compared to the murders of the past. So one can only imagine how horrified Orwell would be in 2022 by how much more the quality of murders has deteriorated. But in his essay, he described the hypothetical perfect English murder, and of course, the weapon of choice was poison. A year after Orwell's essay was published, and surely unrelated to and uninfluenced by this essay, the most English of serial killers was born. One who would come to be known as the teacup poisoner. So if your pantry is stocked with tea, now may be a good time to brew some, as we begin our story about the teacup poisoner. Founded in the early 1960s, John Hadlin Laboratories, known to local as Hadlins, was a manufacturer of camera equipment based in the village of Bovingdon, some 30 miles north of London. 41-year-old storeroom employee Ron Hewitt's workday was interrupted by a sudden bout of diarrhea. Now, this is something that, happens to the best of us, but Ron's cramps persisted throughout the work week. It seemed like he'd come down with some kind of stomach bug, he thought, and it was only once the weekend arrived that his symptoms started to ease. And by Monday, when Ron returned to work, his discomfort was pretty much gone. But then, by late Monday afternoon, his stomach cramps returned, and he once again spent much of the rest of the week doubled over on the toilet. And Ron wasn't alone. 59-year-old storeroom supervisor Bob Agla suddenly became ill with a bout of diarrhea, and these debilitating cramps were accompanied by other random symptoms, like a strange burning sensation in his throat. So now, both Bob and his younger coworker Ron were experiencing waves of similar symptoms over the course of the next few weeks. But then Ron's time at Hadlin's came to an end as he took a job with another company. And miraculously, this stubborn stomach flu disappeared as soon as he began his new job. In early July, Bob began experiencing numbness in his fingers and extremities, a pins and needle feeling, and by the end of the workday, he was in so much pain that he was hardly able to move. And sadly, the previously indestructible Bob became one of those rare, unlucky people. By July 7th of 1971, Bob's respiratory system had become completely paralyzed, and he died, with the official cause of death being of bronchopneumonia. Bob's death sent shockwaves through Hadlin's. Again, this is where he worked. And one coworker who seemed particularly captivated by Bob's death was the 23-year-old storekeeper, Graham Young. Graham seemingly couldn't get Bob's death out of his mind. He talked about it with his coworkers nearly every day, evidently quite disturbed by the mystery of it. Which is understandable, right? I mean, a previously healthy coworker suddenly gets sick and they die. I think that would haunt me too, especially if others in the workplace were also getting sick. And that's indeed what was still happening. 39-year-old Jethro Batt, who also worked in the company storeroom, began feeling queasy on Saturday, October 16th of that year. He pressed on with work, returning to the Hadlin storeroom each day feeling worse than the last. His legs had stopped working altogether, the pain was radiating to his stomach and chest, and his hair was falling out. On Tuesday, October 26th, 4 of Fred's colleagues were out sick, all with similar symptoms. That was Jethro, David, and Hadlin's secretary Diane Smart and her husband Norman. And that afternoon, Fred, whose spouse Annie also worked for Hadlin's, which was, a friendly workplace that looked after its employees, suddenly raced to the toilet, experiencing the same ominous diarrhea that had preceded the more serious illness of several of his coworkers. Within a week, Fred's symptoms slowly subsided and he was almost back to normal, when suddenly, almost overnight in the first week of November, Fred's condition took a nosedive. He suddenly had become so ill that he lost the will to even communicate, and like two of his other colleagues, had to be admitted to the hospital. And another person who seemed to prioritize Fred's condition was the young man who worked closely with him as his trainee, Graham Young. Now, Graham was most certainly an odd young man. He was slightly built at 23 years old, with hands barely larger than a teenager's. His duties were varied, and as a newish hire, still learning the ropes, he largely functioned as a gopher, tending to chores as menial as conveying items from the storeroom to the lab, managing the tea trolley, and serving his coworkers tea in their personal mugs. Now, perhaps you can already guess where this is going. Because before Graham was hired, Hadlins learned that 23-year-old Graham had previously been institutionalized at Broadmoor Hospital, which is a high-security facility known to house criminally dangerous individuals. They were led to this discovery by initially questioning Graham directly when he was still an applicant about the lack of employment history on his resume. Now, Graham explained that he had suffered a mental breakdown when he was young due to the unexpected death of his mother, and he spent some time at the mental hospital, but eventually made a full recovery. But if it were 2023 that Graham was being hired, any of his hiring managers or coworkers could have easily gone to a newspaper archive like newspapers.com and typed Graham Young into the search bar. And in doing so, they would have found countless news headlines from nearly a decade earlier. Headlines like, "The boy who played with poison," "Boy who gave his family poisons sent to Broadmoor," "Brilliant youth obsessed by poisons felt sense of power." His coworkers would have then learned the real reason that Graham Young had spent nearly a decade at Broadmoor Hospital, perhaps soon enough to spare the lives of their coworkers. Because Graham Young had an obsession with poisons that began very early on, when he was just a boy.